We're going to have pressure on renewable resources, massive increases in demand. Development is a very resource-intensive exercise. But again, these countries tend to be very poor countries for some strange reasons, tend to save a lot. So they're going to be still a source of global savings, but they're also going to be big opportunities for investment. If one of the rosy pictures of the North Atlantic financial crisis has been that potentially capital which used to flow from the poor countries to the rich countries now has the opportunity to flow from the rich countries to the poor countries, because we've discovered that the rich countries don't know actually how to allocate capital very well. And again, there's this development of these poor countries, emergence of China and India have the source potential for major environmental damages, but also enormous opportunities, because we have an opportunity to intervene before these countries reach the stage of development that we have. Now, just to show you how quickly the world is changing, this is a chart showing you the share of energy consumption. And as you will understand, the US is by far the biggest energy consumer in the world, followed by China. But if you look at it not in terms of where the world is, but how is the world changing, this is a chart of the additional demand for energy between 2000 and 2006. Nearly 50% of the additional energy demand has come from one country, that's China. So the changes that are going on are very big. This is a chart from a recent paper I did with Adam Cagliarini at the Reserve Bank, looking at prices of energy and prices of materials and what happens when China and India grow quickly. And you can see here, this is the actual data. You can see that between 2003 and 2007, we had a threefold increase in the price of energy, a doubling of the price of mining, and actually almost doubling in the price of food. So there's some very big changes going on as a result of China and India. One of the key questions is, will the world run out of resources? And my own view is there are short-term issues associated with the allocation of these resources, but it's unlikely that the world will actually run out. What really matters is how quickly does the supply side respond. Canadian tar sands become very, very cost-effective at about $50 a barrel. There's an enormous quantity of oil under Canada, bigger than Saudi Arabia. So the substitution to those sorts of substitutes is possible on the supply side, but also people will respond on the demand side. And so over time, we're likely not to run out of resources, but we could be talking a decade or two. And so in terms of the impact for Australia's terms of trade, it's unlikely that we're having a permanent terms of trade shock because of these responses, but it is likely we're having a very long-term terms of trade shock. One of the key questions that comes up is, what will be the environmental consequences of what's happening in the world if we're not pricing the environment properly? If we don't have a carbon price, if we don't have a price on degradation of the environment, what will happen when the world expands to the extent that we think it will? Another issue is demographic change, and I won't say much about that. I just wanted to show people a graph again. A lot of data, you probably can't see what's going on here. I just want to make 2 points off this graph. One is that these are the projections from, if you look at the from 1950 to 2005, the world is sort of growing at a fairly constant rate. From here on out, the UN is projecting all economies will slow down in their population growth. And that's a critical change in the world economy. So all economies' growth rates are falling. But what's more important is that if you look at the zero axis, there are a few countries whose populations are actually shrinking. Former Soviet Union, Japan, and even China by 2040, the population is expected to be shrinking. Now, the reason that's important is because there's some very important compositional effects. This graph shows you elderly dependency ratios. This is the number of elderly people over 65 relative to the working age population. You can see in this projection, by 2050 in Japan, there will be 10 working people for every 7 retired person. Now, that's a fairly substantial adjustment that has to be made. But that's not true just in Japan. In Europe, for example, there'll be, for every 10 working people, there'll be 5 retired people to support. And this demographic transition is happening particularly actually, unfortunately, in China, because in China, the number is 10 working for every 4 elderly. And the question that is in the minds of policymakers in China is, will they get rich before they get old? Because their demographics are very, very problematic. And I'll finish off talking about climate change. And again, this is a question that I spend most of my working time on. And there's a critical point in the terms of institutional design and policy design. Is it better to sit around a large table and design a global policy that we all go away and implement, or is it better to have each country implementing a credible, clear, transparent set of policies given their own national circumstances and coordinate that over time, building up to a global system? Now, I have a very strong view on that the former will not happen, and that what's going on at Copenhagen now is what happened at Kyoto in 2007, which would be lots of political pronouncement, lots of goodwill, lots of hope, but no firm policies. And emissions today are well in excess of any forecast of emissions made in 1997 of what emissions would be today. So for all the debate about Kyoto being a success, we are 4 or 5 standard errors away from what we thought emissions would be, even without a policy response. In terms of the framework, I think the problem with Copenhagen is that the negotiators are focusing on the wrong set of questions. What they're thinking about is equality of targets, but we know what countries want, and this came out of the Bali meetings, is they want equality of effort. Now, equality of effort is very different to equality of targets. If all countries have exactly the same target, the effort required to achieve that target will depend on your population structure, the resources available in your economy, the energy systems you have, whether you have a nuclear power industry, whether you have fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas laying around, whether you have access to renewables. So the effort is not embodied in a target, the effort is embodied in what does it cost. And so therefore, really what we need to do is balance the need for this global concentration target, which is not an annual emission target, which is what's being negotiated. It's a concentration target of emissions over a long period of time. The target of which, by the way, is very uncertain. Is it 350? Is it 450? Is it 250? Is it 650? The science on that is very uncertain. So we're dealing again with a very uncertain world, but we have to balance the costs against the environmental goals.